my remit was to discuss quilts in the context of textile furnishings in the home within our symposium that's happening about quilts in context. And this is an enormous topic. I want to tell you a little bit about the background where I'm coming from, because what I'm going to be talking about is a little bit different from the kinds of things that you most frequently hear about quilts. Winterthur Museum, for those of you who have not been, is an enormous institution. It's based on the ancestral home of a very wealthy collector, Henry Francis DuPont, who was collecting initially just to decorate his home, and then, couldn't stop. Between the 1920s, when he first built a house on Long Island, his summer home on Long Island, which I'm going to show you some photographs of, and then expanded his ancestral home on the Winterthur estate between 1929 and 1931 during the depth of the Depression. So he amassed a very unusual collection, and it's within the context of that collection and the context of his collecting that I'm going to be really speaking to you today. The talk is really going to be split into three, hopefully somewhat related topics, which are furnishings, formalism, and folk art. These are three of my favorite rants. I'm a woman of rants, and so these are my favorite rants. I am not attempting to give you a comprehensive history, but I'm going to be discussing aspects of quilts in a domestic context that are less well known and very closely related to the work that I've been doing on Winterthur's collection, which I believe has got a wider relevance, so I'm just not navel-gazing here. So I am not going to be talking about the quilts with really wonderful personal stories. In this case, a quilt made for John Russell, the minister of Old Otterbein Church in Baltimore, who was leaving that church in 1854, or really about any of the other beautiful quilts that were made to commemorate and celebrate personal events in the lives of their makers, and which are so highly prized today. What I'm going to be talking about first are the types of quilts, often but not always, made by professional women working in the upholstery trade or in embroidery and quilting workshops who were quilting to earn a living and used to furnish homes, very often in the early periods, furnishing them with quilts that were symbols of wealth and of status. The stories of these quilts start very early, in this case in the 17th century, and this quilt was probably located in Italy or somewhere in that part of the Mediterranean. We really know so very little about these early quilts, once thought to have been made in India for the Portuguese trade. My colleague at Winterthur, Maggie Litz, has researched this quilt extensively and has not found any evidence of their use in Portugal or of their making in India. So as we were beginning to wonder about this, we sent some samples off to Europe, and my friend and colleague Jan Wouters did some dye analysis for us and showed that this yellow color was produced by weld, a European dye stuff, and therefore really not something that could or would have been made in India. Early quilts were often made in pairs, and what is believed to be the mate to this quilt is in a collection in England. And I'm hoping that you're going to be able to see this because it's really light, but there's a central ship in the middle there, and around that central ship is a strapwork with 4 medallions of men wearing turbans, sort of very Eastern kind of dress. The mate, the piece that we believe is the mate for this, has men wearing European headgear in those roundels surrounding the ship. Maggie, who did the research on this quilt, feels that this was probably made to commemorate the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. That battle, if you're a little sort of shy on your history, right? That battle was the first naval battle where Europeans defeated the Ottoman navy. At that time, the Ottomans were coming into Europe and looking to take over. And so that event was depicted in paintings, in tiles, in tapestries, and other fine and decorative arts for over the next 100 years, something that was really resonated for a long time. So I guess that is a commemoration of some kind, but not really a personal one. I'm showing this example of what is sometimes known as false quilting because the back stitches of the geometric design on the ground are worked through only 2 layers. There's no batting in this so-called quilt. But these needlework bed covers, embroidered in this case in gold silk, were highly fashionable in the wealthy households of England in the early 1700s. This example was purchased by the donor who gave it to Winterthur from the sale of Ashburnham Place in England, which is a large historic house that got sold off. The contents got sold off in the 1950s. The people who had owned Ashburnham Place for centuries had been major courtiers in the courts of Charles I and Charles II, kings of England, so you knew that these people were important people with a high status in society at the time. This was made in a professional workshop in London, and the quilt itself, the bed quilt on the far side, had a number of matching cushions, only one of which survived. Originally, there probably was a pile of 3 cushions of diminishing size that would be piled on the foot of the bed as another show of wealth and comfort. I'm showing you a detail here because close examination of the needlework shows the original design drawn on the fabric for the geometric quilted design that's the background. And I can if I move with this, I can move here, right? So here you can see evidence, I hope you can see evidence, of a red line that's been hand-drawn in vermilion, the design by which those embroiderers would follow. And this would have been done, it would have been made as a yardage with this standard design being embroidered yard after yard after yard to create this quilt. Then, after all of these minute background stitches were done, somebody else came in and drew the design for the more elaborate embroidery in a black ink. And that in turn was embroidered by a team of probably women, mainly women, although men also did embroidery at that time, to create what was really a luxurious bed cover at that time. The ground is a very fine and tightly woven cotton, really, really, really fashionable and unusual at a time that linen would have been more common. In the early 18th century, imports of printed and painted cottons from India were banned in Britain in an attempt to protect their wool and their silk industries. But it remained legal to export these fabrics, to import them into London, and then re-export them to the plantations or the colonies of America or to elsewhere in Europe. These vituperative calico debates went on and on and on for about 20 years as this ban was debated backwards and forwards. But I find it very interesting that one argument put forward of not banning them was the employment that it gave to poor quilters in London who would be taking these beautifully hand-painted and printed fabrics, cotton fabrics by India and actually quilting them using wool batting and linen threads, and often a linen backing like this one has, to create bed covers. So why would people be interested in the employment of women quilters in a debate that had concerned international trade? Well, wealthy people had to support the poor through the charity of their parish structure at that time. And so one thing that happened was that people were very interested in providing work to keep the poor off of these parish registers. What you're seeing, whoa, here, is the stamp of the United East India Company. And this example in Winterthur's collection has got a history of ownership in a family in Delaware. I was able only to trace it as far back in terms of documents to an elderly woman who died in Wilmington in 1880, and her obituary was headed, "Death of an Eccentric Woman." I love it. When I began researching Winterthur's collection, I realized that a large proportion of the collection, much larger than any other museum collections that I had seen, consisted of 18th century and early 19th century printed whole cloth quilts. These types of quilts have not been at the forefront of quilt scholarship, collecting, or exhibition, and I really knew very little about them. And why did Winterthur have so many? Well, the answer that I came up with was that Winterthur's founder, Henry Francis DuPont, inherited a quilt and a set of matching bed hangings through the family of his mother. And they're seen here in use at Winterthur in the 1890s. Yeah, you can date them from the sleeves. Exactly. Yeah, we can all date these things very closely now, right? It was a Tuesday, right, Joan? It was a Tuesday. Sorry. Henry Francis DuPont was inordinately proud of these. And using this evidence, he very correctly deduced that these were the type of fashionable furnishings that were in use in the American colonies and in the later in the New Republic. And whenever he saw something that he liked and he responded to and felt was suitable and sophisticated and elegant enough to furnish his home, he bought them in large quantities. And I have a room full. In honor of the exhibition, Indigo Gives America the Blues, which I've so much enjoyed seeing here, I thought that I would show a quilt and matching bed hangings made from a type of print that's often known today as indigo resist, but which in the 18th century was known as paste print, a paste print. The quilt that you can just see on the bed there is a period quilt, and the hangings that you see, the valance and the curtains, are antique fabric, but they were made into a valance and curtains in the 20th century, designed from, copied and modeled on period examples. The paste print trim, you can see that blue and white tape trim around that valance, that is also antique fabric that has been reused by Henry Francis DuPont. Using this type of antique fabrics was a common practice amongst wealthy collectors at the time, but that's a whole nother lecture. The point I want to make with these is that these quilts, these beautiful quilts, were not used in isolation within the home. They were part of a whole set of bed furniture, which is what they were called. Here's an example of a period valance. A lot of valances survive in the way that curtains don't, because curtains are yardage and you can make them into something else. But here is a paste printed valance, one of many in Winterthur's collection. And I'm showing you a number of details so you can see that really lovely spotted border around the edge. And I don't know whether you can see it at the bottom here, But the beautiful small, can you just see those tiny little stitches? This is the most amazingly high quality hand stitching that you'll see on a fabric that was not the most expensive at its time. Did something happen? Can you still hear me? Okay, good. Sorry, maybe I should stop moving around. So, because I know that you're very interested in quilts, on that first bed that I showed you, I thought I would show you the quilt that you couldn't see in that photograph, and here it is in its entirety, just one of these standard whole cloth quilts. In this case, it's the pattern of the fabric and not the quilting that is at issue, and so most of these pieces just have very straightforward, diagonal crossed lines, or just very basic quilting patterns on them. But what makes this example so extraordinary is the back. Yes, isn't that wonderful? I love that too. Many of these paste prints were produced in Germany, in France, in Scandinavia, in Romania, in a lot of Central European countries, and in Britain, and in Ireland, and in Scotland. Most of the ones with these blue grounds I thought to be French or German, but here is an example that I feel pretty sure is probably originally British. From the 1750s, copperplate prints were highly fashionable amongst British and colonial upper middle class who were often very wealthy. I want to make sure that you understand that the upper middle class, the gentry level in Britain, were people who were very, very wealthy, often very, very highly educated, elite merchants, lawyers, bankers, but above them in the social snobbery level was the nobility and the royalty, right? So the gentry level were these types of quilts and bed hangings and fully hung beds were highly fashionable amongst this upper middle class level of society. We know from surviving records that floral designs were the most widely produced and the most widely used, but they are not the most common to survive. What tends to survive are these figural prints. This one is copied, the designs were taken from a 1785 publication of Fenelon's novel, The Adventures of Telemachus. First published in 1699, if you don't remember reading it at school, the story ostensibly was about Telemachus, who was the son of Ulysses and Penelope, who, with the goddess Athena, who was conveniently disguised as his guardian mentor, they were cruising around the Mediterranean, which went in search of his father, who was taking an awfully long time to come home at the end of the Trojan Wars. So Penelope, the whole story about her weaving. So this story and this book that was published in 1699 has been interpreted both as a criticism of the lavish spending and despotism of the French monarchy, but it also has been interpreted as an advice manual for youth, emphasizing self-control and financial economy. Hard to believe it was a bestseller for centuries. I suspect it was much more strongly popular with the parents than the children. Nevertheless, people would sleep in beds fully surrounded by scenes from this story on their curtains, their bed hangings, and their quilts. Here's another example of a bestseller that appeared on your bed furniture. Here's a whole cloth quilt that depicts scenes from Oliver Goldsmith's very long, and I have to admit, very boring poem, The Deserted Village. I read the whole thing. That poem talked about the land clearances and enclosures of land in the late 18th century, when many rural tenants were displaced as the British agricultural practices changed. Some of these people moved into the cities to work into the factories, the textile factories, the textile print works, but others of them crossed America. In the 18-teens, when this quilt was made, everyone would have recognized this story of the dance and the departure, and this was wildly popular in America, despite the fact that America was referred to as that horrid shore in the poem. In this case, two different 18th century chinoiserie fabrics that were once used for bed hangings were stitched together to make a quilt in the 19th century, but there is evidence that these quilts and bed hangings using fabrics of these chinoiserie fabrics of this type remained in use for considerably long periods of time. The fragments of the inner border, and so I'm really talking about this fabric here, not the central one and not the one on the outer border, but that fabric has been found used as bed hangings that are associated with a house in Guilford, Connecticut. Cultural historian Betsy Garrett Widmer has discovered that the abolitionist and author Harriet Beecher Stowe slept in a bed in her aunt's house made from fabric used for that border that was said to have been brought back by a seafaring uncle. I've got to tell you, all of these are thought to have been brought back from seafaring uncles, so I'm not sure I'm believing that, but you know, hey. Stowe recalled in her journal, and I'm quoting, "the almost awestruck delight with which I gazed on the strange mammoth plants with great roots and convolutions of branches, in whose hollows appeared Chinese summer houses adorned with countless bells, with sleepy-looking mandarins smoking, and a Chinaman attendant just in the act of ringing some of the bells with a hammer. Also here and there were birds bigger than the mandarins, with wide open beaks just about to seize the strong-looking insects, and a constant wonder to me, to my mind, was why the man never struck the bells, nor the bird ever caught the insect." This is what a fully furnished, fully hung bed in the late 18th century would have looked like, with curtains, valances, and quilt that are all original and all period and not renamed. This fabric is a famous one in this country, known as the apotheosis of Washington and Franklin. And we know that it was used widely for furnishings on both sides of the Atlantic. Remember that not everyone in Britain was against the Americans during the Revolutionary War. Many people supported the bid for representation in Parliament. Not everyone was represented. Not everyone had the vote at that time. Many of them were anti-monarchists. So there was a lot of support for the American Revolution on both sides of the Atlantic. But we do know that this was used widely in this country. In 1785, Tommy Shippen described exactly this type of bed hangings in a letter to his sister Nancy, who, as far as I can tell, was the biggest flirt of the American Revolution. He was staying at his uncle's house in New York. Richard Henry Lee, his uncle, was at that time serving at what was called as the President of the Congress, and so he lived in the President's house, but it wasn't George Washington, the President's house, it was the President of Congress. And Tommy wrote to his sister, "My chamber is a spacious and elegant one, and prettily furnished. I'll now write in it, and which way soever I turn my eyes, I find a triumphal car, a liberty cap, a temple of fame, or the hero of heroes," which means George Washington, "all of these and many more objects of a piece with them being finely represented on the hangings." So there's someone who's sleeping in this bed. This quilt and these hangings were made by professional women working in the upholstery trades. either in the major cities of the East Coast of America or in London. The ubiquitous encyclopedist Denis Diderot illustrated the workings of a French upholstery workshop in the mid-18th century. So you can see the empty chair frames at the top, the stuffed and covered cloth-covered chairs, which are still familiar to us today as the work of an upholsterer. But notice the many textile furnishings. Notice that canopy and its hanging. Notice what looks like a pile of comforters, which are probably mattresses. Note in the back room at the top of the stair, a valance and some hangings and whatever that is folded up with the guy that's coming down the stairs. And notice the women sewing in the table in the background. Before elaborately hung beds went out of style in the 19th century, it's been estimated that the women's side of the upholstery trade represented at least half of the income generated by these businesses, if not more. These were not the women who were working in ateliers in Marseille or the specialist quilting workshops of London, making quilted petticoats or embroidered bed covers, but women working in upholstery workshops, or some of them possibly as outworkers for such businesses. The larger upholstery firms operated more or less like interior designers do today, providing a variety of services to their clients, which included making curtains, bed hangings, and matching quilts. A big side of the women's side of the upholstery trade was making mattresses. And you're seeing here an illustration from an 1836 book of trades published in Glasgow. And doesn't that look like a quilting frame to you? There's really a very fine line between what is a mattress and what is a quilt. And if you go in the real Wayback Machine to the 14th and 15th century, the term quilt very often just means something puffy and luxurious, and is often interpreted to be a mattress rather than a bed cover. In this case, one woman is carding wool for the filling, but mattresses could be filled with a variety of materials, including curled horsehair, feathers, or down. Many upholstery workrooms had a space known as the feather attic, regularly renewed. Can you imagine all those feathers getting old, right, before you had dry cleaning? And we know that Betsy Ross's younger sister, Rachel Griscom, did this type of work for the wealthy Philadelphian Elizabeth Drinker in the late 18th century. So this was a common type of work for women in the upholstery trade. Oops, did I turn this off? There we go. It is due to Marla Miller, who's the author of the only scholarly biography on Betsy Ross, that we know as little as we do about the women working in the upholstery trade. More properly known as Elizabeth Griscom Ross Ashburn Claypool, Betsy trained and worked for about 5 or 6 years under the supervision of Anne King, who was in charge of the women's side of an upholstery business run by a man named John Webster in Philadelphia. And these are her glasses and her homemade glasses case. Betsy's first husband, John Ross, was a journeyman in the Webster's shop, and together he and Betsy set up in business on their own after they married. After Ross's early death, Betsy married twice more, advertising her upholstery business each time in the name of her husband, although neither of them had anything to do with the business. One was a mariner, the other one was a customs official. It was only after she was widowed for the 3rd time that the business was advertised in her own name, which at that time was Elizabeth Claypool. Betsy is best known for making flags, and this is what I believe is the closest possible candidate for a flag that was really made, that could have been made by Betsy Ross. It's an Indian presentation flag from the early 19th century that belongs to it's in the collection of the Chicago History Center. Many Philadelphia upholstery shops turned to making flags and other military equipment during times of war, either the Revolutionary War or the War of 1812. And we know that Betsy, like the others, did that. The issue of whether Betsy did or didn't make the first American flag is not an issue that I'm going to go into now, but we do know that she undertook a variety of other types of upholstery work, the women's side of the upholstery trade, although sadly Marla has not yet been able to document that she made quilts. She did make bed furniture though, so it's very likely that she could have made quilts. We know, however, that quilting was part of her life and the life of her daughters and her nieces, many of whom would leave home and then come back to work with Betsy in times of need. This quilted petticoat descended in Betsy's family and is said to have been worn by her, but whether she made it or not, I couldn't say. The Ouija board is my research tool of choice. So if anybody would like to join me, maybe we can find out. We haven't been able to prove it otherwise. However, many other members of her family made some beautiful quilts as personal treasures rather than commercial products. In fact, when we were researching possible objects for an exhibition held at Winterthur about Betsy Ross based on Marla's research, I thought it was going to turn into a quilt exhibition at one time. There were so many examples survive in the family, most of them produced by generations after Betsy, though. But we did put in some really key examples. The example that's on the wall there, I put in specially for Carolyn. Where are you, Carolyn? Because I know you'd like to see it. This was made by or for Betsy's niece, Margaret Donaldson Boggs. Her initials, the only name that's on this quilt, are quilted in the center of that chintz applique, Philadelphia chintz applique quilt. Margaret first lived with Betsy as a young girl after both her parents died, and she moved back in with her aunt after the death of her own husband, Joseph Boggs, and she became a key figure in Betsy's upholstery and flag-making business. And if you can just see, there's a pieced silk quilt in the case in front of it. That was made in 1841 by friends and family as a gift for Catherine Canby, the daughter of Betsy's youngest daughter, Jane Claypole Canby, and it was Jane's son, William Canby, who, during the time of the American Centennial, made his aunt, Betsy Ross, so very famous by claiming that she had made the first American flag. Another beautiful quilt in the exhibition was made by Betsy's daughter, Clarissa Claypool Wilson, whose portrait you see there a little bit obliquely on the right. Clarissa had married an accountant at a time when accountants, that was a new kind of business, that was a new kind of occupation. They didn't have accountants very much before then. But he was an accountant, and they moved to Baltimore. But after she was widowed, after her husband died, she moved back to work with her mother, and the business became known as Claypool and Wilson. Betsy retired about 1827, but Clarissa continued the upholstery business for another 30 years until 1857, when she moved to Iowa to live with her daughter in her old age. This quilt is still owned by one of her descendants and remains in the family. I don't know about you, but I find it amazing that a woman who earned her living with her needle would choose to create a complex quilt requiring so much stitching in what must have been very precious spare time. So that's kind of the end of my first rant, and my second rant is about formal design. I started thinking about formalism in quilt design when I was researching the extraordinary quilt made in 1815 by Mary Remington of Warwick, Rhode Island, in the year before her January 1816 marriage. Not only did Mary make that bed cover, but she quilted the valances on the bed and the demi-lune dressing table cover that you can see at the far side. I love telling Mary's story, which is really just like a soap opera. You know, did he marry her for the money? Was her father going to get a divorce? Was her husband playing around when he was building ships in New York? It goes on and on and on, but that's a different lecture. What I really want to do is to focus on the design of her quilt and the sophistication and formalism of this design. The central cartouche right in the center of the quilt contains the Remington family coat of arms with the helm, and I'm hoping you can see this because it's really hard. So with the helm, the crest, the shield, the mantling, and surrounded by palm branches at the bottom with a motto ribbon that says, "By the name of Remington," all quilted in stuffed work quilting. Phenomenal tour de force of quilting. She obviously was a very, very skillful woman. By the 18th century, the whole system of heraldry was beginning to fall apart. Originally, heraldry, these coats of arms, were intended to be a means of identifying all of those knights in shining armor. That's what it was originally for, knights in shining armor. Arms were granted to individuals, not to families, and still, according to the rules of the College of Arms in London today, there is no such thing as a family coat of arms. The format of the shield and the crest in particular change with every generation. So no one has exactly the same coat of arms, but similar motifs and things come down through the family. We know that coats of arms were used in this country by people who may or may not be entitled to have used them. We know that they were painted on the doors of carriages. We know that girls embroidered them at school, some of them with designs very much like the one that Mary Remington quilted. My point is not really to discuss the vagaries of heraldry, though, but of formal design, the formal format that you find in many types of quilts. I want to compare Mary's heraldry to the use of the Lauderdale cipher and coronet in the parquetry floor of the Queen's Closet of Ham House in Surrey, installed in the 1670s. The cipher was not a coat of arms, but a decorative motif, and it operated in much the same way, signifying wealth and status in the family, in the same way that Mary was using her coat of arms on her quilt. Both of them, and I'm hoping you can see this, both of them are surrounded by a type of design that's often known as strap work, a style that's seen in use by the late 17th century for over a century, and which itself was signifying tradition and heritage. These old-fashioned, very traditional designs are the kinds of things that come to the fore when you want to show how important you are, or you're celebrating a major family occasion like a marriage. Sorry, can I go back? There. Mary was the only child of her parents. She was due to inherit her family's considerable wealth, and she would lose her surname upon her marriage to Peleg Congdon in January 1816. So the issue of women's surnames Whether to keep it or change it when you're married is not a new issue. It's not an issue that came to the fore in the 20th century. It was one that was very much debated and discussed, and there were rules all about it, especially if you were an heiress. It's worth noting that both of Mary's sons had the name Remington, her maiden name, as their middle name. And so that was a very important thing. Many people did that. It was a very meaningful, important thing. I want to make sure that you're understanding that I'm not just associating with a floor just because it's got some kind of a motif. I'm associating it with floors for a purpose. The design of Mary's bed comes out of a European tradition of formal beds. The example that I'm showing here is the famous Melville State bed, made for the first Earl of Melville in 1700, and it was intended to demonstrate his wealth and status to anyone who saw it. This was a time when the fabric was the most expensive thing you would own after maybe your silver plate. It was far more expensive than any piece of furniture you would own, and the lavish use of fabric and trimmings was the sign that you were wealthy and powerful. These kinds of beds were found in special bedrooms created mainly for show, or occasionally stayed in by somebody like the king. But these were not utilitarian beds in everyday use by members of the family, and these were not everyday bed hangings. This is now in the V&A, and I'm going to be talking about the design on the counterpane and inside the tester, but I couldn't find any photographs of it to show you, so you're going to have to trust me when I say that this is in a long line of things that I'm going to be talking about, of designs of floors and ceilings. The format for architectural, strong architectural ceilings, for reflecting designs in ceilings and floors, was a widespread one and became particularly popular with the advent of neoclassicism in the 18th century. And I'm showing you here the formal drawing room at Austerley Park, a house not far from London, which was remodeled in the late 18th century as a glamorous country retreat for the Child family, owners of Child's Bank. Banking was a very lucrative business back then, as it is today. The interiors were designed by Robert Adam in the 1760s, who designed both that ceiling and the Axminster carpet that is on the floor in the drawing room. I'm getting closer to quilts. For the state bedroom at Austerley, Adam designed the ceiling, the bed carpet around the outside of that bed, and the state bed itself, that are all related in the architectural context for that room. Adam also designed the counterpane, the bed cover for the bed, which reflects the design in the tester, and that round thing at the bottom is what you would see if you were lying in that bed and looking up. That's the tester. And what I'm also hoping you can see is that central medallion with the 4 circles. Can you see the 4 circles and a little bit of the medallion in the ceiling? That is the architectural connection with the design of that bed cover. Here's the entry hall. It's easier to see in plaster and stone, but here's the entry hall at Austerley. What I want to stress is that these neoclassical designs were very fashionable throughout Europe, but they were incredibly fashionable in the new American Republic after the Revolutionary War. This neoclassicism, harking back particularly to Rome and the democracy of Rome, was something that the Americans were very, very proud of making that connection. I know that if anybody goes to Rome, I get any of my friends that go to Rome, I end up with these photographs going, oh look, this is just like a quilt, taking pictures of all of the tile and mosaic floors, right? People are nodding. You've seen it. You've all taken the pictures. Okay, so there is a connection. There really is a connection. It's not in your dreams. What I want to show, though, is that this connection is intentional and that women would have been aware of these designs even if they had never traveled outside of the American colonies or the new American Republic. One way that they could have been familiar with these designs is through pattern books, widely circulated on both sides of the Atlantic. And what I'm showing you here is the title page of a book of floor decorations published by John Carwitham in 1739. And what I'm hoping that you can read is that he claims that this will be useful to gentlemen and workmen by the perspective views in ye several headpieces as entertaining to the ladies in coloring them. So many of these architectural pattern books were available and used not just by men, but also by women. So here are a couple of examples of floor designs in that book, and I'm hoping that you can clearly see the relation to quilts. One very interesting thing amongst women scholars at the moment is work that's being done to establish the value, the cultural value of women's craft work in the 17th and 18th century, the kind of people who would have been coloring these or making quilts or working embroidery, and the cultural and social value of their work, which is not something that we've recognized before. So here are two more. I want you to note that the designs are represented as if the quilt was hanging, but then at an oblique angle. And that's an important thing because these designs were specifically used because when you're looking at a floor, you're not looking at it straight on. You're looking at it at an oblique angle. And think about it. If you were seeing a quilt on a bed, you're not seeing it straight on. You're seeing it at an oblique angle as you walk into that room. So here are some illustrations from Diderot's ubiquitous encyclopedia. Everybody uses Diderot, so I'm sorry. These were published between 1762 and 1772, but I'm going to put them alongside some quilt patterns that will also show that these quilt patterns were very closely associated with these architectural designs for floors. This is a quilt that was made in Hallowell, Maine, about 1800 by Martha Agri Vaughan. This second one is much more simple, made with fabrics that were fashionable in the 18 teens and a very simple pattern of blocks on point. And here is a quilt that's a slightly later example made for Elizabeth Webster about 1850. This style of quilt was fashionable among the Orthodox Quaker community in Philadelphia, and Winterthur has a very closely related quilt on which Elizabeth Webster's name is made that was done as a friendship quilt made and put together by family and friends to celebrate the marriage of Sarah Williams and Samuel Emlyn. Sadly, Elizabeth Webster's fiancé jilted her, and hers is the only name that appears on her quilt, which descended through the family of her niece and her namesake until it came into Winterthur's collection. It's not just floors that influence the design for quilts. In the early 19th century, the science of optics, geometry, and design and pattern reform were of interest to a variety of early design reformers. The forerunners of people were like Sir Henry Cole, who was involved in the Great Exhibition in London in 1851 and helped found the Victorian Albert Museum, whose collection was originally intended to be a source of inspiration to designers at that time. Another of these reformers was David Ramsey Hey, who published this book amongst many others, a member of the Edinburgh-based Aesthetical Club, a society dedicated to founding a science of beauty based on mathematical principles. Hey designed carpets, geometrical pavements, and paper hangings, which were all viewed by the spectator with various degrees of obliquity. So Hay's book of geometrical diaper patterns, and the word diaper just means a repeating pattern, not something that you cover a baby's butt with, right? It's a small repeating pattern. Includes many designs like this that I'm hoping that you can also see the relation to quilt patterns. And here's an example with overlapping circles. And forgive me for the poor quality of this image, but it's the only one that I've got of a wool whole cloth quilt in Winterthur's collection. I know that the design is not exactly the same, but I'm hoping that it's close enough that you can see this connection to geometry, mathematics. These quilts were often made by highly educated women. They just didn't have that piece of paper, that diploma from Harvard or the University of Nebraska-Lincoln to make it official. So I hope that you'll recognize this quilt as being part of the whole movement of formal design that relates to architecture, science, geometry in the 18th and 19th centuries, the sophisticated designs of highly educated women and men. This is a friendship quilt made by Hannah Woolston Kohls of Camden, New Jersey in 1841, and it descended in the family before coming to Winterthur in 2007. So this is an example of very formal design, architectural related design, quilts seen as the floor of your bed. So how did we get from there to here? The commonly held view of quilts in the early 20th century. This picture was published in Country Life in America in December 1910 and associates quilting with rural, uneducated, elderly women and the folk traditions of bygone days, which is the final theme of my talk, the folk art part. Yeah, pretty amazing, isn't it? The definition for folk art has been much debated for about a century and remains a thorny issue today. Interest in the fine and decorative arts produced by conservative rural communities grew out of the 19th century romantic nationalism of Europe, a time of great unrest, when smaller countries who had been subsumed into larger empires sought to promote their own identities, or where countries which had been reduced to poverty in the 19th century looked backwards to their days of greatness. This promoted the study of traditional local customs, sometimes termed peasant traditions, and one of the most well-known proponents of this was the Swede Artur Hazelius, who created and toured exhibitions of folk costume and other decorative arts, and studied traditional music, dance, and foodways, which were thought to be rapidly disappearing due to industrialization. Hazelius founded the Nordiska Museum of Swedish ethnography and the nearby Open Museum at Skansen, which I'm showing. And if you ever have the opportunity to go to either of those, they're wonderful with fabulous textile collections. Winterthur's founder, Henry Francis DuPont, was an early collector of peasant costume, which he acquired first on a trip to the Balkans in 1907 with his close friend, the landscape architect Marion Coffin, and her mother. These are some of the photographs that they took. Coffin published a description of their trip in an article in National Geographic magazine the following year. Folk art is often termed the art of everyday life. And Henry Francis DuPont did write a letter to someone where he said, "I'm so interested in everyday life." This is a man who had opera music piped down throughout his golf course, and who didn't know how to tie his shoes because that's what valets were for. But he was very interested in everyday life. The United States had become heavily industrialized in the 19th century, and the reaction was an interest that focused on the survival of pure, honest, and traditional communities in this country, the equivalent of the European peasant communities, which is a little difficult to define an American peasant in a democratic society. This trend was part, but not all, of what later became known as the Colonial Revival, when antique quilts were collected and really beautiful new ones were made, and there's some wonderful examples in the exhibition here. Quilts and other decorative arts influenced the modernist artists of the early 20th century, and here I'm showing a painting by Charles Sheeler, who is better known for his abstract paintings of industrial sites and buildings. But this painting is entitled American Interior and dates from 1931. Many designs for the hooked rugs and things are very similar to quilt designs, so I hope that you can see a connection, because I wasn't able to find a modernist painting that depicted a quilt. The later photograph I'm showing you here shows Sheeler with Edith Gregor Halpert, whose downtown gallery displayed both folk art and modernist paintings and sculpture. She worked very hard to popularize Sheeler and other early modernist American painters and artists, but the folk art that she sold upstairs in her gallery was her bread and butter and kept the business in operation. The overlapping of the worlds of anthropology, folk art, and modernism came together in an organization known as the Folk Art Society, with a gallery on Fifth Avenue in New York, where they showed an exhibition of Hawaiian quilts in 1938, and I'm showing you a wonderful example from the collection here. Franz Boas, who is considered the father of American anthropology, was the honorary president of that society. And other members included Edith Halpert, the woman with the gallery, and supporting modernist artists. Winterthur's founder, Henry Francis DuPont, who was the chairman for a while. Lucy Morgan, the founder of the Penland School of Handicrafts in North Carolina. Holger Cahill, an art critic and curator at the Newark Museum, who later became the head of the Works Progress Administration in 1935, and many others. I mean, there's a glorious list of these people. But the one person who should be well known to quilt scholars was Ruth Ebright Finley, a journalist and an author. And I want to quote from the foreword to her 1929 book, Old Patchwork Quilts and the Women Who Made Them, linking quilts with this modernist aesthetic. And she said, while the present-day vogue for patchwork is due primarily to a deeply stimulated interest in all things historically expressive of our national background and growth, the wide and varied use of old quilts undoubtedly has been greatly furthered by the modernistic trend in every branch of decoration towards brilliance of color and boldness of line. Today's taste is not shocked by such antique combinations as purple and cerise, nor by compositions so stark as to be geometrical. So reviews of the exhibitions mounted by the Folk Art Society tell how interior decorators as well as modernist designers were interested in the shapes, forms, and motifs found on quilts and other types of folk art. And in case you can't read that, let me quote the first paragraph, where this review by Walter Rendell Story says, homely, sincere, and decorative in the modern sense of being well suited to its function, the old-fashioned article made in home or village workshop still serves the uses for which it was intended, and at the same time inspires many a motif for modern-made furnishings. Because this material is so highly valued today, it's really difficult to remember that folk art in particular and American decorative arts in general were quite controversial in the 1920s and 1930s, when many wealthy collectors felt that only European material was worthy of the term art. Elektra Shelburne, who you see here with her husband, She, of course, founded Shelburne Museum in Vermont. Her mother had an important collection of art, much of which is now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She once very famously said to her daughter, "How can you, Elektra, you who have been brought up with Rembrandts and Manets, how can you live with such American trash?" And of course, in addition to the cigar store Indians and Schimmel Eagles, much of her collection included many exquisite examples of quilts. And like other collectors of her time, she used quilts to decorate her country house in Shelburne, Vermont, on the bed, but also cut up and used to upholster the chairs. There's a piece quilt covering that chair in the background of her bedroom, and then this easy chair with the funky wheel on the back was upholstered for Mrs. Webb by Wanamaker's department store, a department store that sold quilts and other antique textiles and other antiques. So the role of department store has very much changed today. There's also a wonderful bedroom in the upstairs of the brick house, and if you ever have the opportunity to go, you should see it, that is completely lined with pieced fabric that was probably once a quilt. So it is difficult for us to comprehend now, but it was once very fashionable, especially amongst wealthy collectors, to use antique quilts to cover their furniture. Here are two examples taken from the influential magazine Arts and Decorations. Wanamakers, who upholstered that chair for Elektra Havemeyer-Webb, imported French quilted petticoats, which had just the right amount of yardage to cover an easy chair. I know, I was booed once when I started talking about this. When Henry Francis DuPont, who also dealt with Wanamakers, queried the high price, Mrs. Tyson, who ran their antiques department, replied, "While they are all old, still they are not over 100 years old." The key being that if something is over 100 years old, you don't have to pay import duty on it, which jacks up the price, okay, right? So they're not over 100 years old, so that we are forced to pay duty on them. Our man who collects these quilted things for us in Paris tells us that they are probably 60 to 75 years old. We get them in rather deplorable condition and have them cleaned in Paris before they're sent to us. This wasn't just a fashion in America. Another article from Arts and Decoration describes the quilted chintz furniture covers used in both the London and Paris apartments of the couture designer Elsa Schiaparelli, who is a close friend of Salvador Dali and other surrealist artists. So this was very, very chic and highly fashionable. So in America, these types of interiors where modernism and the Colonial Revival met and mingled, you can notice here the aesthetic collection, at least I hope you'll notice the aesthetic connection between a Quaker quilt that was used on a bed at Winterthur in the Philadelphia Empire bedroom, and a hand-tufted rug designed by Marion Dorn, who was one of the most important textile and carpet designers of the 20th century. I first started realizing this connection when I discovered this late 19th century quilt in Winterthur's collection. It was so completely different from Henry Francis DuPont's aesthetic that I couldn't imagine why he had bought it. So I gave it to a student as a project. It's great having students, right? I gave it to a student as a project, and Justina Barrett tracked it down and discovered that it had been used upside down on a bed in the Patuxent room. DuPont valuing the geometric quilted design of that sort of beige, light brown background on the cheap cotton backing rather than the glory of the fully saturated colors on the front of that pieced quilt. Albert Barnes, whose art collection has recently been moved into central Philadelphia from its original home in Marion, which is just outside of the city, also decorated with folk art and quilts. So you're seeing Albert and Laura Barnes outside their country house, Kerfial, in Chester Springs in 1942, and a quilt on the table in their show kitchen inside. They had a completely separate kitchen where all the food was actually cooked. This was their show kitchen. The Barneses and the DuPonts were very close friends, and Albert Barnes saw connections between his collections and the collections at Winterthur. So the Barnes Foundation still teaches classes in Barnes's somewhat quirky approach to art based on commonalities of shape, design, form, and color, which he elucidated by displaying ironwork, painted chests, and a variety of other decorative arts and crafts alongside his Renoirs and Cézannes, which themselves were very controversial at the time. And these are so one of his most famous pieces is in the top corner there, called The Dance by Matisse, which was carefully transferred to central Philadelphia from its original home in Marion. Matisse often used textiles of various kinds in his paintings, and one of my favorites is this, which is in the Barnes collection in Philadelphia. And so Matisse bought that fabric in an antique shop in Paris and used it more than any other fabric in his paintings. And if I'm clicking, here is the beautiful example in your collection here of that very same fabric. Can you see the basket repeated backwards and forwards? So I couldn't resist, because this is such a beautiful quilt, I couldn't resist showing this one, but I need to tell you that I have acres of this stuff too, and DuPont did decorate, not a quilt, but decorated a room with this, and he was very fond of these paste prints that are very resonant to my eye to some of the work of Raoul Dufy, another modernist painter. So as folk art began to be fashionable in the 1920s, antique quilts were hung on the walls as works of art in galleries and in the homes of the wealthy elite. In this case, in DuPont's summer house, Chestertown, in Southampton in the late 1920s. They were also used to create beautiful interiors at a time when the field of interior design was just becoming professionalized. But always these quilts were in the country homes of these wealthy collectors. On top of the aesthetics, quilts were still associated with warmth and comfort. And the story here, this is two views of what is known as the Nemours Room at Winterthur. Staying at Winterthur could be an enormously stressful occasion, and DuPont would take tours of the house after these elaborate dinner parties. There's a story of one woman who arrived late and went running up to her room and threw off all her clothes and got dressed for dinner, went running down, and then DuPont started leading the tour after dinner. And they got closer and closer to the bedroom that she was staying in, and she thought, oh my goodness, I left my stockings hanging over the bed, and I left, and he opened the door and swept in, and she said it was like she had been dead, like she'd never been there. It was all beautiful and looked completely different. And one of the reasons was that for show in the Nemours Room, DuPont had a unquilted whole cloth bed cover, not even a pillow in sight, right? Not a bit of comfort. But when the room was used for guests, there was a pieced quilt with that same design on the fabric used as a border around the edge. And so that was what was used for guests, but the whole cloth bed cover was used for show. So it was really only in the late 20th century that quilts and folk art came to be prized and displayed in the elegant apartments of the rich and famous in New York. The difference is not that they weren't prized and displayed in elegant interiors, but before the 1970s, those interiors were in the country houses of the wealthy elite within the context of Winterthur and DuPont's collecting. But what really is different is their location in the city, the aesthetics of their arrangement. But what remains the same is really the diversity of the stories that these quilts can tell in the context of people's homes and the domestic interiors. Thank you very much.